I want to briefly discuss the most commonly used speech devices in speeches. Many of you might already know some of these from any English classes you've taken, so it might be a refresher. For others of you, it might be new information. Either way, we're going to go through all of these, and on the next slide, I'm going to show you some examples so that we all have a common understanding of these different types of speech devices. So the first two, simile and metaphor. These are quite similar with one very specific differences. When you're comparing two things as a simile, you use like or as to compare them, whereas with a metaphor, you do not. So if I were to use the example, let's say New York subways, the New York subways are like sardine cans. That would be a simile. If I just said New York subways are sardine cans, that would be a metaphor because I'm not using like or as. So that's the one difference between simile and metaphor. Simile uses like or as when comparing two things, and metaphors do not. New York is a zoo. New York is like a zoo. Personification is when you give human-like characteristics to things that are inanimate objects. If I say, gosh, this chair looks awfully tired, well, obviously a chair doesn't look tired. So that would be an example of personification. It is giving the concept of a persona or a person to an inanimate object. An oxymoron is when you take two things that are opposite and and put them together. So if I were to say jumbo shrimp, that is a commonly used oxymoron. Mad happy is another commonly used oxymoron, right? You can't be both mad and happy at the same time because they're almost opposites. So oxymorons often is using opposite concepts in the same type of speech. Hyperbole is basically the same idea as exaggeration. If I were to say, you're going to have to study for 10,000 hours to pass this midterm, that would be hyperbole. If I were to say, oh my gosh, it is so hot, I'm going to die, that is hyperbole because you're probably not actually going to die from the heat. You're just using that example as an exaggeration in the way that you speak. Irony is one that often gets confused. It is when the opposite of what's expected to happen happens. So a good example of irony would be that the firehouse burned down. Right? That's ironic because normally at a firehouse you have the different people and the different trucks are going to go help other people combat fires, but the fact that that burned down is ironic. Onomatopoeia is often used. My kids are very much into graphic novels right now, and they use a lot of onomatopoeia. Bam, whiz, whenever you use language that is using the actual sound of what something is to describe it is using onomatopoeia. And lastly, a rhetorical question. A rhetorical question is one where you can assume the answer. So you're not actually asking the question. You're just asking the question with the expectation that it's not needed to answer because everyone already knows the answer. So if I were to say something at the beginning of a speech, let's say for a hook or an attention getter, where I said, how many people would like to be homeless in 5 years? That would be a rhetorical question because I can assume that nobody actually wants to be homeless in 5 years. So these are the most commonly used speech devices. I'm going to show you some examples on the next slide so that we can all work through which is which. So which one of these, well, let's start with the one on the top left. The damage on this First World War memorial was caused by bombs dropped during the Second World War on May the 24th of 1941. What is that? Well, that's an example of irony, that this damage was done as a memorial by bombs that were dropped during another war on the memorial for that particular war. So that's an example of irony, something that you don't expect to happen at a war memorial. As playful as a kitten, that would be a simile, right? There's like or as, so that way it's a simile. Pow. Pow is an example. Remember, we talked about what you see often in graphic novels. That's an example of onomatopoeia. Dry Creek Water Park. That is an example of an oxymoron. Right? If it's a dry creek, but it's also a water park. So those two things are almost like opposites. That is the example of oxymoron. You are my sunshine. That is a metaphor. It's not using like or as. It's not saying you are like my sunshine. It is saying you are my sunshine. My dress shoes are killing me. This is an example of hyperbole. Yes, your shoes might be hurting your feet, but they're probably not actually killing you. How should I know? That's an example of a rhetorical question. What they're saying is, I don't know. So they're not actually looking for an answer. They're just saying, how should I know? And lastly, the car was suffering and was in need of some TLC. That is an example of personification. Obviously, a car is an inanimate object and doesn't actually need TLC in that sense. So these are examples of different uses of speech tropes and speech devices that you might use in your speech. When we meet, we'll give some other examples and talk through them so everybody's very clear on the different meanings of all of them.